So, following the Democratic blue wave that swept a lot of progressive Democrats into office, Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership in the House are now already trying to kneecap progressive legislation. That same legislation that has swept a lot of Democrats into office. Now, The Intercept is reporting that the House rules package for the 116th Congress, which would be, of course, Democratic controlled, will now include something called pay as you go provision. Now, basically what that is, and this is something that Pelosi had before and had campaigned on bringing back, is basically it would require all new spending to be offset with either budget cuts or tax increases. Now, you might hear that and be like, well, hey, you know what, that sounds reasonable. You got to pay for things, right? Well, if you do think that way, well, then consider this, right? Consider the following information, especially if you're in support of things like Medicare for all. That's a single payer healthcare system, as well as free college, tuition free education, and things like the Green New Deal. Now, what Paygo is, in reality, is a conservative plan to basically tie the hands of government so that our politicians actually cannot enact good policy. Now, David Dayen writes that Pelosi, who's prepared to take the speaker's gavel on Thursday, has been pushing Paygo for months despite strong opposition. Now, according to Dayen, quote, she ran into resistance from progressives who believe that the rule would make it more difficult for Democrats to pass a host of liberal agenda items, from Medicare for all to a Green New Deal to tuition-free public college. Now, this is true because a lot of that legislation would require tax increases on wealthy Americans, corporations, and members of the top 1% and the top tenth of 1%, who over the last 10 years have actually gotten most of the gains from economic growth. Now, taxing the rich to pay for a lot of these things is actually incredibly popular, but that doesn't actually mean that Congress will pass tax increases. I mean, if you want to look at popularity versus actually getting policy, just look at background checks in which 91% of Americans support, and yet Congress has refused to even take up the issue. Now, on this, critics also argue that Paygo creates an unlevel playing field, where Republicans get to blow giant holes in the tax code, as they did with the 2017 tax cuts, while Democrats get to play fealty to the deficit. Now, that's really important. And that's the situation that we've been in for quite some time. Republicans pass giant tax cuts. Democrats go, oh, no, we must be fiscally responsible and not do anything even remotely progressive. And anybody who doesn't see that right now is either, they don't know how politics works, they work two jobs and can't pay attention, or they just don't understand the game being played, or they're part of the game. Now, Republicans, basically, this situation sets up a situation where Republicans get to do everything that they want on behalf of their donors, while Democrats handcuff themselves through this rule and say, what could we do? The Republicans wouldn't let us give you single-payer health care, so we had to settle with the ACA. Now, Waleed Shahid, who is the communications director for the Justice Democrats, had a few words on this. In a statement to The Intercept, he said, there's enormous appetite in the Democratic Party and among all Americans for major public investment to tackle our nation's major crises, deepening inequality and structural racism and climate disaster. Remember, we have 12 years left in order to take bold action on climate change with a Green New Deal. We can't afford to pussyfoot around and do things and enact rules that basically constrain us from the get-go. And that is what she is trying to do. Now, Shahid continues, he said, Pelosi and the Democratic Party's leadership support of Paygo actually makes solving these crises all but impossible. The Democratic Party leadership is unilaterally disarming and shooting themselves in the foot. Now, for those who have paid attention to Democratic Party politics for the last few years, such as myself, we know that is basically par for the course for the Democrats. Even though they get swept into power, on bold policy proposals, they find ways to use the system to be able to handcuff themselves to make sure that they don't do that policy. Now, that's really, really weird when you consider it. You think, now, wait a minute. Democrats, they promise this stuff, and then when they get in the office, they make sure that they can't do it. Why would they do that? Well, there is a purpose behind it. And of course, it is, for one, to win elections, but two, to make sure that they continue to service the donors. And so Pelosi sees this stuff as, we just handicapped those progressives. Now our donors can continue to make money from the status quo. And that's what it's about. Pelosi has taken millions of dollars from the health insurance industry. I'm sure she would love to be able to stop Medicare for all in its tracks. And that's exactly what this legislation does. She thrives in the status quo, and she wants there to be a gatekeeper to prevent that kind of progress that imperils the donors. And Paygo, of course, is the mechanism that she will use. Anybody who thinks that Pelosi is still a progressive has not paid attention at all to her record. I don't believe she has ever been progressive. Now, here's the impact of Paygo, right? And again, we have history to draw on. When Pelosi was Speaker before, she instituted this similar rule. Now, the impact of that, of course, is pretty clear. Last month, the Economic Policy Institute put out a paper arguing that during the Obama administration, Paygo led to unnecessary shrinking of ambitions in areas like healthcare, why we didn't have a public option or even Medicare for all on the table, and an unsuitable response to the Great Recession. They wrote, "It is terrible economics." This is Josh Bivens, who wrote that report. He said, "It is terrible economics to view federal budgets deficits as always and everywhere bad. If public spending followed the Great Recession if public spending following the Great Recession had followed the average path of the recoveries of the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, a full recovery with unemployment around 4% would have been achieved by 2013. Instead, that didn't happen. Poor people continued to get poorer. People lost their homes, their careers, and were put in massive amount of debt, and then had to go and take out student loans in order to retrain themselves to the economy, while, of course, the rich got richer. If Pelosi ends up getting Paygo, and we eventually get a progressive president in 2020, there will be no change. There will be no Green New Deal. There will be no free college for all. None of the promises that will be made during the upcoming primary and presidential campaigns will happen because they have already been killed in their infancy before they even began. But we can stop that from happening. The vote is happening on Thursday, tomorrow. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ro Khanna, two Democrats, Justice Democrats, real progressives, have pledged to vote against this rule. We need 16 other Democrats in the House to join them to fight against this terrible rule package. Call your representatives, right? And I'll have the number in the description of this video. Urge them to stop Paygo, to vote against. All we need are 16 Democrats, and we can stop them. If you care about policy, if you care about Medicare for all, if you care about a Green New Deal in our environment, you will join in this effort to get a hold of your congresspeople and to tell them no on Paygo. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on, and you guys will know that you're supporting independent progressive media.